There's a recurring pattern in global power that most people never notice until it is too late. A pattern that repeats so consistently across history that ignoring it almost feels irresponsible. When you look closely, you see that several superpowers, nations that once seemed untouchable, maintained global dominance for roughly 50 years before entering a period of turbulence, internal stress, or irreversible transition. Some historians call it the half-century arc. Others simply refer to it as the dominance window. But regardless of the name, the structure remains surprisingly similar every time. And this pattern, after shaping the rise and retreat of multiple global powers, now points toward a critical moment for the United States in 2025. What makes this even more compelling is that none of these nations recognized the turning point while living through it. They all assumed their power was permanent. That assumption turned out to be the most dangerous belief a superpower can hold. Consider the British Empire at the height of its influence during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. After the Industrial Revolution, Britain became the world's manufacturing hub, the center of global finance, and the unmatched naval authority on the seas. Its currency, the pound sterling, was trusted everywhere, and its companies and traders operated in almost every corner of the planet. Many historians place Britain's undisputed dominance somewhere between the 1850s and the early 1900s, a span of about 50 years where no competitor could challenge its industrial capacity or political influence. But beneath the surface, signs of stress began emerging. Domestic political divisions grew as debates raged over labor rights and colonial governance. Rival industrial powers such as Germany and the United States rose rapidly, eroding Britain's manufacturing advantage. Costs of maintaining the empire increased, especially as far-flung territories demanded administration, policing, and economic support. By 1914, the tension between global obligations and internal stability became visible. By the end of World War II, the British Empire was no longer a global superpower in the same way. What had looked like unmatched dominance had lasted roughly a generation and a half before the pattern shifted. A similar arc appeared in the Soviet Union, but in a different form. Rather than global economic dominance, its strength was rooted in ideological influence, military capability, and geopolitical leverage. After World War II, the Soviet Union emerged as one of the two major poles of the international order. Its rise as a superpower was rapid, especially between 1945 and the early 1990s. But its peak dominance, where it shaped world events with broad confidence, was roughly from the 1950s to the late 1980s. During this period, the USSR projected influence through the Warsaw Pact, extended technological competition into space, and maintained the largest land army in the world. From the outside, it seemed immovable, yet decline began from within. The economy stagnated under central planning systems that could not keep pace with innovation-driven growth in the West. Ethnic and political tensions simmered across the republics. Military spending soared as the country struggled to match the United States in every category of the Cold War arms race. By the late 1980s, these pressures collided. Within a few years, the system fractured. Again, dominance lasted nearly half a century, followed by an abrupt transformation few predicted would happen so quickly. Japan's story adds another dimension. Its rise was economic rather than geopolitical. From the 1950s through the 1980s, Japan became a model of technological advancement, industrial efficiency, and export-driven growth. By the late 1980s, many analysts believed Japan would surpass the United States as the world's leading economy. Its 50-year window of dominant momentum seemed unstoppable. But then, almost suddenly, the bubble burst. Asset prices collapsed, banks froze, and decades of stagnation followed. The shift was not caused by war or political revolution. It emerged from internal financial and demographic pressures that accumulated quietly during the boom. Yet again, the roughly 50-year pattern appeared. These examples, when observed collectively, hint at a structural rule rather than isolated coincidences. Nations rise, consolidate power, and operate at near-peak influence for around 50 years. During this window, institutions grow confident, economies expand rapidly, and global authority seems secure. But during the same period, the seeds of strain begin developing because dominance creates its own challenges. Economic saturation reduces growth potential. Political systems become more polarized as different groups compete over resources and direction. Institutions that were once efficient begin to age, slow down, or become weighed down by bureaucracy. Debt accumulates as governments try to sustain rising expectations. Military commitments expand beyond what is strategically necessary, creating long-term burdens. Technological revolutions slow as the early phase of rapid growth gives way to more incremental improvement. And new challengers rise, often adopting innovations more quickly than the established power can. This repeating mixture does not guarantee collapse, but it consistently produces a point of inflection, a moment where the superpower faces internal and external pressures at the same time. That moment usually arrives around the 50th year. None of these transitions are identical, but the rhythm is surprisingly stable. And throughout all of them, citizens living through the height of dominance tended to believe their nation's leadership in the world was permanent. In hindsight, it never was. This brings us to the United States, a country whose modern era of uncontested leadership is often traced back to a specific year, 1971. While America emerged from World War II as a global power, the post-1971 period marked something different, a shift from being merely the strongest nation to becoming the core of the global financial and economic system. When the U.S. abandoned the gold standard and the dollar became the world's primary floating reserve currency, a new structure formed around American power. Global trade, oil markets, international banking, and sovereign reserves began depending heavily on the U.S. financial system. The United States could borrow in its own currency at unmatched scale, invest globally, project military power across continents, and shape international institutions that reinforced its influence. For roughly 50 years, from 1971 to 2021, the United States operated within a dominance window that functioned much like the British industrial century, the Soviet geopolitical arc, and the Japanese economic boom, but on a larger scale. Within this period, American technology led global innovation. Companies in Silicon Valley reshaped communication, software, entertainment, and consumer behavior worldwide. The U.S. military secured strategic positions across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, often setting the terms for global security. Financial networks rooted in New York became essential to international trade. Higher education institutions attracted students from every major economy. Cultural influence spread through film, music, and digital media. These were unmistakable signals of a superpower at peak strength. Yet, beginning in the early 2020s, subtle but consistent cracks began appearing, resembling early-stage versions of patterns seen in past dominant powers. Inflation returned after decades of stability, something many Americans had never experienced in their lifetimes. The national debt crossed unprecedented thresholds, raising questions about long-term fiscal sustainability. Political polarization intensified to the point where basic governance became difficult, and trust in institutions fell to historic lows. Manufacturing capacity declined sharply over decades, reducing resilience in supply chains. Geopolitical commitments stretched across multiple regions with rising uncertainties. Meanwhile, global initiatives aimed at reducing dependence on the US dollar gained traction, particularly among emerging economies. Across the world, alliances and trade networks began shifting in ways that suggested the emergence of a more multipolar order. These developments do not indicate collapse, nor do they predict a specific outcome, but they align with the early signs that typically appear near the end of a dominance window. Since 1971 marks the beginning of America's modern financial leadership, 2021 represents the approximate end of the 50-year mark. What follows is often a period where structural pressures intensify, and the decisions made in the next few years determine how a superpower adapts to a changing world. This is why many analysts view 2025 as a critical point. It is not simply because of a single event, but because multiple timelines and pressures converge around this year. The political cycle in the United States is reaching a period of heightened volatility, and upcoming elections carry unusual levels of uncertainty. Fiscal deadlines, debt ceilings, and long-term budget projections begin intersecting in ways that demand structural solutions rather than short-term fixes. Global conflicts and regional tensions increase the complexity of foreign policy commitments. Rival economies restructure their trade systems, energy relationships, and financial institutions in ways that reduce reliance on American leadership. At the same time, technological competition accelerates as nations invest heavily in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and advanced manufacturing, all areas that will shape the next economic cycle. Inside the United States, demographic shifts, generational divides, and changes in the labor market add new layers of complexity. Younger generations carry different expectations for governance, culture, and economic opportunity. Older institutions, shaped decades ago, struggle to adapt to these new demands. Social media amplifies divisions, making compromise increasingly difficult. Economic inequality fuels debates about taxation, welfare, and investment priorities. These pressures accumulate gradually, but they accelerate once the dominance window begins to narrow. Historical patterns suggest that when internal strain and external challenge happen simultaneously, nations approach a turning point. This does not guarantee decline. It simply means transformation becomes unavoidable. Every superpower that reached its inflection point faced a choice between adaptation and resistance to change. Britain adjusted by redefining itself as a financial and cultural power rather than an imperial one. Japan shifted from rapid growth to long-term stability with slower expansion. The Soviet Union fractured because its institutions were not built to absorb shocks or reform quickly. The United States now confronts its own version of this moment, shaped by economic, political, technological, and geopolitical factors that have been building for years. For viewers paying attention to these patterns, the question becomes not whether history will repeat exactly, but how this cycle will shape the next decade. Some may see these developments as warning signs. Others may interpret them as opportunities for reinvention. Each perspective is valid, and hearing how people interpret the same pattern differently is often more insightful than the pattern itself. As 2025 approaches, the convergence of debt cycles, political transitions, technological shifts, global realignment, and economic restructuring creates a moment where decisions matter more than usual. It is a rare point in history when the direction of a superpower feels more flexible, more uncertain, and more significant than most citizens realize. These periods tend to define not only the next few years, but the next few generations. When people look back decades from now, they may view 2025 as a year where the United States either resolved long-standing challenges, entered a transformative phase, or began a new chapter in its role within a multipolar world. Understanding this pattern does not provide absolute answers, but it gives context. It reminds us that superpowers are not static. They evolve, adapt, and recalibrate as global systems change. Recognizing the rhythm of history helps avoid fear and encourages a more informed discussion about what comes next. And in moments like this, hearing how others interpret the same evidence can be valuable. Different viewers may focus on economic trends, political divisions, global power shifts, or social dynamics. Each interpretation adds a layer of insight that reveals how complex this moment truly is. The 50-year pattern is not a prophecy. It is a lens, one that has proven useful for understanding how nations rise, how they peak, and how they respond when their period of dominant momentum reaches a turning point. The United States now stands at the edge of such a moment. Whether this leads to renewal, adjustment, or something entirely different remains unknown. But acknowledging the pattern invites reflection rather than fear, curiosity rather than certainty, and awareness rather than assumption. And perhaps that is the most important lesson. History rarely repeats perfectly, but it often rhymes in ways that reward those who pay attention. As the world moves through 2025, the United States will face choices that shape its next chapter. How those choices unfold, and how people interpret them, will determine what kind of superpower America becomes in the decades ahead. The story is still being written, and its outcome is far from decided, which is why this moment deserves careful thought and open discussion.